I'm sorry. I gotta go talk to my daughter.
No, the only question I have, Tony, is whether you want me to.
You don't need to record your side.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
Well, I'm backing it all up to the cloud anyway.
Okay.
Where are you?
Leilani, what's your time?
Right. See you later, guys.
I'm okay.
Yeah, you're okay.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Let's go for it then.
I need to just do my ironing.
Excellent. Great. We'll have to do our proper coffee chat at some point, okay?
Yes.
We're really
well, yes. I mean, now that things are opening up too, and I've got these directives, we should do something in Ireland.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that would be brilliant.
You're the man. So
yeah. Oh, that's great. Let's do that. Yeah, that's a great idea. Okay, we'll go for this now because I know you're under time pressure.
You know what? Did I actually send you the directives, like the latest version?
Keith did.
Oh, he did. Okay.
Yeah, he did. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Okay. Great. Okay. I need 5 seconds. Welcome to Reboot Republic, the podcast that goes behind the headlines and looks at the big issues in this republic of inequality. We are the podcast of solutions and the podcast of hope. And I'm your host, Rory Hearn, and I'm delighted to be joined back on the podcast by a guest who we've had on a number of times before, has been one of our most popular guests we have had on. It is Leilani Farah, who is, of course, as listeners probably will know, is the former United Nations Rapporteur on Adequate Housing, and is now the director of a new movement in housing to make housing a human right across the world called The Shift. And Leilani, thank you so much for joining us back on Reboot Republic.
I love Reboot Republic, and I'm really happy to be here, Rory.
It is so great to see you again. Unfortunately, not in real life. We are on Zoom. But listen, you've put in a massive amount of work, and you've produced an incredible, I think, kind of almost direction forward for how we can challenge and the rise of financialization, the housing crisis that's spreading its tentacles across the world. In Ireland, we know this more than ever, but you've put forward what are called directives, the Shift directives. What are they, Leilani?
Yeah, so you kind of nailed it. This is a forward-looking document. It's a map for how we can undo the housing crisis that is global in nature, that's deeply affecting people in Ireland and elsewhere across Europe and elsewhere across the world. So we call the Shift directives from financialized housing to human rights-based housing. So that's what the document is trying to push. It's to say, look, let's take seriously the fact that housing is a fundamental human right recognized in international law and signed on to by governments around the world. And if we recognize that, and then actually vision a world where that is implemented by governments and investors, we would end up in a very different place than we're in right now. And we can undo the housing crisis if we take seriously housing as a human right. So that's it in a very big nutshell, broad.
Yeah, but of course, there's huge detail in the document in terms of what governments, as you say, what investment funds, what the private market can actually do and what should be done. First of all, maybe to start and explain a little bit, what is, in terms of, as you see it, the housing crisis and financialization?
Yeah. So the housing crisis, I think, has to be defined in sort of two sides to the story. So on the one hand, we've got across the globe about 1.8 billion people living in grossly inadequate housing, unaffordable housing, and in homelessness.
Yeah.
So 1.8 billion, that's a lot of people. We have tenants across the planet, and this is true in the global north and the global south. Tenants barely able to pay their rent because things have gotten so unaffordable. And I mean, the the statistics are the same in city after city after city. So we can look at Santiago, Chile, or Mexico City, Mexico, and then we can look at Dublin, Ireland, and we will see the same thing: escalating housing costs and stagnant wages. So that's sort of on the one side. But then on the other, we have this value of residential real estate. And the global value of residential real estate is now over 230 trillion US dollars.
Whoa.
So that is a staggering amount. I mean, you and I, Rory, we don't know what the heck that means, right? I mean, that's a whole lot of money.
That's a lot.
It's a lot of money. They say, so some of the people who try to make money intelligible to folks like us, everyday folks, they say that 230 trillion is more than 20 times the value of all the gold that has ever been mined, ever. Wow. It's 3 times the GDP of the world. So you take the GDP of every country, put it together, multiply by 3.
Multiply by 3. And that's what real estate is valued at.
Yeah. So to me, this suggests the crisis, right? So then you say, well, so what? So, what's the relationship? The relationship is the people who are benefiting from housing are the people that have access to that value, right? And they are corporations, private equity firms, insurance companies, pension funds, actors that you know very well in the state of Ireland, right?
Yeah.
And they're benefiting. They are using housing to extract wealth. They're gutting housing of its wealth, of its value from tenants, and they're using tenants very squarely. I mean, literally, they are benefiting from the rent that tenants pay. And on top of it, the valuation of the property and all of that stuff. So, I mean, these are very, very closely aligned phenomenon. It's not like, oh, well, every society has homelessness and that's to be expected.
Yeah.
And then there's this financialization stuff. No, they actually sit together integrally.
Yeah. And something has changed, isn't it? Like, you have been working on this since, for over probably heading towards a decade, maybe longer now, myself as well. Something changed fundamentally after the crash in 2008. And I've been looking at it in Ireland, and it's interesting to see, because a lot of people talk about, the property boom that happened in 2005, 6, 7, that led to that financial crash, and the role of property in that, and the excessive lending. It happened in the States. I'm not sure to what extent in Canada, but definitely the States, Ireland, the UK. There was this huge splurge in lending for mortgages. And the kind of narrative goes that, people, the banks lent too much to homeowners, that pushed up prices. Then we had the economic crisis started kind of even in 2006. People became unemployed, the subprime issue and all that. But actually what was also happening then, when I looked at the figures for Ireland, really from 2004 and 2005 onwards, was banks started lending to the buy-to-let sector. And I know the Real Estate Investment Trust started in Canada as well to expand, that they started to invest in property as an investment. And they were competing, just like we know investor funds are now competing with home buyers. They were competing back then. And that led in part to that bubble. But then really we saw, and you obviously highlight this so well in The Push, the documentary, that really it was after the crash, wasn't it? That, 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, when these big funds saw, this is the future. We convert a generation of people who are hammered by austerity, low wages, younger people, millennials who are now in their late 30s. We convert them into renters, and we have money, income into perpetuity. And that's the process that's happened throughout the world.
That's absolutely right. And I love your telling of it, because you're just bang on. Jonathan Gray, who was head of global real estate for a big private equity firm, one of the largest in the world, Blackstone, said that it took a crisis for them to become a dominant landlord in Western Europe and in the United States, right?
Yeah.
And so what they found after the crash in '08 was a whole lot of what they called distressed assets. We would call them distressed families and households.
Yeah.
People who had been sold predatory loans, and who really had invested their lives, excuse me, in home ownership, and were left devastated. For these actors, especially private equity, which is one of the more aggressive investors out there, they just saw opportunity and opportunism. And so they went on a big shopping spree in Western Europe and in the United States, buying up, as you said, homes of everyday people and turning them into supposedly much needed rentals.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm not saying we do need rental accommodation, and, we can get into, how much do we need and all of that stuff. But these were people who were homeowners, and they ended up renting the very homes they were living in some cases, at exorbitant rates, more than the mortgages that they were trying to pay off.
Yeah.
So, and let's make sure we understand that banks are completely complicit in this, as are governments. I mean, governments didn't want to bail out the banks too much. They wanted to bail them out, but they didn't want to bail them out too much. And so they needed someone to buy all this bad debt. And the private equity firms were there. They swooped in and they were like, oh yeah, we'll buy these mortgages at 35 cents on the dollar. And then they made a killing off of that, right? They bought cheap debt, and then they had, as you said, a whole class of people ready to pay rent and having to pay rent because people need homes.
Exactly. And the interesting thing in Ireland, and I wonder how much this is happening elsewhere, is that what happened kind of post 2013, 14 into really up to now, is that the Irish government, and I'd be interested to know how much this is replicated internationally, that in the context of that financial crash and governments, implementing austerity, number one, they stopped building social housing, which was then, in large part led to our homelessness. And I know that is happening across Europe, and we've seen it in the States. Governments, the small amount of social housing that they were building, they cut that further through the austerity budgets. But the other thing is that rather than trying to develop a sort of affordable housing market that would provide, small and medium builders providing affordable housing, or governments, local authorities, municipalities building affordable housing, they essentially turned to these funds and said, these funds will now provide the main form of new housing supply in our country. We give them tax breaks because really our local kind of construction industry developers are broken. As a government, we don't want to do it. The funds came in and said, well, we'll build it for you. So this was after vultures. This was like the real estate fund. So now we have a situation where, in terms of like it's over half of all new planning permissions in the country are now basically investor fund departments. So the new supply has been dominated by these rentals. So people have no alternative but to rent these new properties. How much have they taken over that kind of new supply elsewhere? Have you seen that?
Yes, definitely seeing that in North America for sure. In Canada, where I live, for example, governments will say, when I start agitating it, these real estate investment trusts. And for the listeners, if you don't know what a REIT is, it's really just a financial mechanism to own property and numerous properties all at once. And when I push back and say, to government, you've got to control these REITs, what they say to me is, well, REITs are really integral to our housing supply. They're building the new supply. And so, and of course I say, well, that's nice, but you still need to regulate them because they're undermining the human right to housing. And that's your job as government. But they're definitely in the game on the supply side these days. And, they negotiate, like they'll say, oh, we are going to build affordable housing. Yes, government, we'll do that for you. And then they define affordability in unaffordable ways, 80% of market value, or they'll extract from the government preferential tax treatment, not just in terms of income tax, but property taxes, for example. I've heard they'll say, oh yeah, we will build more affordable but we'll add a few stories and we want our property taxes reduced. Well, what happens when we reduce taxes? There's less money in the coffers of government to do what governments need to do to create happy, healthy societies. That's what taxes go toward. So, it's a double whammy in a way, because you've got, on the one hand, they're actually not creating the affordable supply. On the other hand, they have governments beholden to them, and governments undermining their own capacity to do what governments are supposed to do. So maybe that was a triple whammy, who knows, but it's just bad news, basically.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we are like at the cutting edge of it here. Really, it is unbelievable to see what they're doing here in Ireland now. Like and what government did, and because they have these tax breaks here, like they created a specific tax incentive, as like you wrote in your position as rapporteur on adequate housing in 2019. You wrote an incredible, powerful letter to the Irish government, which people can check it out. It's really worth reading. And it critiqued that whole, tax incentive process, encouraging, financialization. And you raised that whole question. How do we have the likes of Kennedy Wilson in here? We've Greystar. We have all the big global vultures, Lone Star, all making like billions and paying hardly any tax whatsoever. To come back on to, because I want to talk about the positive drive forward, what you're doing. Maybe you could take us through some of what you think, I suppose, are the most important proposals that you're making that should be included in terms of these directives.
Sure. So just to say, Ireland really is the, test case for all of this. In terms of, you have one of the most financialized housing markets in the world, as far as I can tell. I'm always using the example that you told me about in, I think it's Maynooth, where single family homes were built, new builds, and only a handful were purchased by actual households, and the rest were purchased by some big institutional private equity investor, and then let out as rentals at exorbitant rates. That is such a powerful example. So,
interestingly, since I told you that story, because of the public outcry, the investor fund actually pulled back and the developer decided not to sell.
Amazing.
Which was very interesting. And the government—
That's good for me to know, actually, because it shows that if we make enough noise, if we say, no, this isn't cool, this isn't the way forward, we can stop them in their tracks.
Absolutely. And there's a very interesting angle is the government, as a result of that public outcry over what the investor fund and the developer did, introduced measures which restricted new developments of housing from being bulk bought by investor funds, but not apartments from investor funds, which was a really, manipulative way. So essentially the apartment sort of sector is now completely free reign to the investor funds. But listen, you tell us the directives.
Yes, that's also good for me to know. Thanks, Rory, for that piece of information as I head off to the EU to launch these directives. So the shift directives, there's 10 of them, so it's pretty hard to summarize. There's lots of recommendations. It is very forward-looking document, but just so readers, well, maybe the listeners will become readers.
Exactly.
There's, as I said, there's 10, and it covers a whole range of financialized activity. So the really straightforward stuff that we're talking about right now: real estate investment trusts, pension funds, private equity, and their activities, but also things like short-term rental platforms, Airbnb and Vrbo, and et cetera, and what needs to happen on that front. We take a look at some of the more sort of emerging, what are called asset classes, but emerging places and spaces where institutional investors are putting their money: student housing, for example, and long-term care homes. So it covers a broad range of activity within the sort of financialized world. We start off, and I love where we start off because this is home territory for me. I'm a human rights lawyer. I'm not a finance person. I just find myself in this world. I think you're a bit similar to me, Rory. We find ourselves here. So we start off with encouraging governments to do what they've already committed to do, which is to uphold housing as a human right and to legislate it. And, putting that, and I know this is a live issue in Ireland, and I really hope that you see some kind of movement on that front, whether it's constitutional reform or just a legislated right to housing. It's super important that governments lay that foundation, because once that's laid, it enables them to use human rights as they roll out housing policy or any policy that affects housing. And so I really think that foundation is essential. And I said that as rapporteur, and I continue to say that. So that's where we begin.
Yeah. And for us, just to say, like it is in terms of, for me, and I know many others in the housing sector in Ireland and NGOs, for us, it is vital. It's constitutional, because the Constitution sets out what we want as a society, what governments are obliged to do. And I think fundamentally as well, I think the process of a referendum would be a societal kind of expression of and decision, and also political mandate to government saying we want housing to be treated as a human right. So that's where I think the power and creating, as you put so well in terms of the directives, what does delivering a human right to housing mean in terms of policy, legislation? And for us in Ireland anyway, the Constitution is our document from which everything else flows. And I think for us anyway, it's important that it's constitutional. Continue.
That's right. No, that's right. And look at what's happening in Chile right now. The Pinochet era constitution is being reformed and renegotiated, and people are demanding that social and economic rights be included in the Constitution, in particular, the right to adequate housing. And they have a really lovely articulation of that. And it is super important in that context as well. And there are real parallels with Ireland, because believe it or not, Chile has one of the most neoliberal housing markets in the world. I mean, they kind of set the stage for the rest of Latin America, unfortunately. They are demanding that constitutional reform.
So what's the nice articulation that you...
Don't ask me that.
I put you on the spot.
Quite a long, it doesn't just say everyone should have the right to adequate housing. It's quite a long thing. I think they talk about a dignified life, and it's broader and has more elements. Their constitutional reform is running some 400 pages. So they get the kind of details, whereas,
ours is,
in Commonwealth countries or in Anglo countries, we have just high level, right? One little
former Commonwealth.
That's right. I said Anglo.
Anyway, so listen, continue. Yeah, great. The directives and so in terms of getting, governments is the first one in terms of them meeting their obligations around.
That's right.
What is their human rights obligations as set out.
That's right. And really asking them to step up, because though governments have stepped up, what they've stepped up to do is to support, as you so well articulated, they've stepped up to support finance. We're saying, no, you got to step up and support the human right to housing. And that extends in particular to the most vulnerable populations, right? Or marginalized populations. So that's super important. And that lays the foundation. We then go directly to the big institutional investors and take a look at their activities and make several pretty strong recommendations. Again, focused on states, actually focused on government. When I say states, I mean governments and all levels of government. So depending on how your political arrangements are, some places have very strong local government, some places have very strong central government, but saying that states must ensure that investors in residential real estate comply with human rights. In other words, not just that governments need to legislate and constitutionalize the right to housing, but they also actually have to extend those human rights obligations to investors and ensure investors are not undermining the human right to housing by doing things like requiring human rights impact assessments and due diligence on the part of investors. Like, have you ever seen that in?
Absolutely not.
No, exactly. And I know that might seem mild to some people, but I think it's a game changer because it invites the conversation. Actually, it provokes the conversation. It means, one, that investors and developers would have to understand the human right to housing in order to do an impact assessment, in order to do due diligence, right?
Yeah.
So it actually requires a whole level of education and familiarity and fluency with the human right to housing. So we go down that path.
Yeah.
We ask states to define affordability when they're interacting with anyone in the area of housing, consistent with human rights. And this is something that few people know. But under international human rights law, there is a definition of affordability.
Yeah.
And it has nothing to do with what a market can command.
So what is it?
There's no mention of markets.
Yeah.
It's commensurate with household income.
Yeah.
Housing is affordable if you don't have to deny yourself or your family other human rights in order to pay the rent. In other words, if you're going without a meal a day because you need to pay your rent, or if you're cutting back on the warmth of your unit because you can't pay the high cost of heating and pay your rent, then you know your rent is too expensive. And that's not affordable under international law. What international law doesn't say, and this might be disappointing to some, it doesn't say that housing is affordable if your costs are no more than 30% of your income.
Yeah.
They don't actually give a percentage, but we know through social science research that 30% is a nice marker to use, and that if you're paying much more than that, you're having, especially if you're at the lower end of the economic spectrum, you're having a hard time making ends meet. And
in fact, some would argue, and I would argue, that 25% is probably given in particular countries like Ireland,
right,
in Canada, the US, where you don't have other public services. So you're spending higher costs on things like healthcare, childcare. It's different in countries like Austria, Denmark, where they have other public services. Whereas in countries, again, the Anglo-Saxon ones who follow the neoliberal model, that are high cost societies, that where you're spending over, I think 25% on your, take home pay on housing, you're in trouble trying to survive. And particularly now with the cost of living crisis and inflation.
Yeah, I think that's a super good point, actually. And I'm going to start using that, if you don't mind, Rory. I will attribute it to you. I think that's really important. And the way, as you said, all these services have been completely gutted in a place like Canada, for example. In the US, they really don't have social housing in the US anymore. I mean, it's incredible. They have manufactured homes, like mobile homes. That's like housing of last resort there. I mean, which is privatized and being taken over by private equity. I mean, it's amazing. I'll just add the other thing that we say, that you and I have raised in our chat so far as a recommendation, is a review of tax policies and the removal of special treatment for investors through taxation. I mean, that would create a real chill, I'm sure of it, because we know, for example, in Spain, immediately after the global financial crisis, like in 2008 to 2009, they had the capacity legislatively for real estate investment trusts to exist. They weren't used. That instrument was just simply not used because there were no tax advantages when Spain introduced REITs.
Yeah.
Then in 2013, I think it was, they introduced preferential tax treatment, and REITs are used consistently and persistently ever since.
Yeah.
So that suggests if you take away the tax benefit of that structure, then we might see a real chill in the sector.
Yeah.
But I don't want listeners to think we let institutional investors completely off the hook. It's not just that we're saying, states, you have to do this and make sure investors are tamed. we also say, and hey, investors, there's a thing called business and human rights. There's a thing called responsible investment, so social impact investing that actually abides by international human rights standards and norms. And so we push that in that section to make sure that investors start understanding that they have real human rights obligations, not this ESG mamby-pamby stuff. I don't know if your listeners will know, when there's this whole wave of corporations adopting what they call environment, social, and governance criteria in their business models. But those are being
like their ethical investment strategies.
Yeah.
But it's being corporate social responsibility.
Exactly. I mean, it's corporate social responsibility by another name.
Yeah.
And it's being used to greenwash, but also to social wash as well.
Yeah.
So you'll see, if you go to some of the big investment firms, you'll see that they talk about
I actually was on an investment fund website last night doing research for my book, and I came across specifically one of the big funds, and they had that ethical, it was actually one of the investment funds, and it had like, we do ethical investment alongside, while you're investing massively in REITs, which are doing nothing ethical whatsoever. Just in terms of, I was interested, the short stay platforms, I think, is very interesting as well, because I was reading recently, I don't know if you read the interviews with the CEO of Airbnb and his vision for the future of Airbnb, which is utterly terrifying. That what they see, he says, we actually won't need landlords in the future. Tenants don't need contracts or lease contracts. They'll just do short stays, a month here, a month there, maybe they'll be homeless for a month, and then maybe they'll be able to afford rent for 2 weeks. And like, it is really horrific, I think, in terms of their vision for housing.
I did read that, and I was equally horrified. And we do have some recommendations that go to that.
Yeah, because that's really important for Ireland, because essentially Ireland, because we're a small country and quite a high tourist country, essentially anywhere in this country is a potential Airbnb. Yeah. And it is really problematic right now. We are seeing landlords converting all over the place out of rental into Airbnb, and complaining that because of increased government regulation, they're moving to these short stay platforms, and companies taking over entire blocks of apartments, renting them out on these short stays, and people literally being evicted into hidden homelessness because of these short stays, that they are as bad as the investors in some ways, and also very hidden. It's very hard to get a picture where they are, and particularly the ones that aren't advertised publicly.
Yeah, I mean, the amount of affordable housing stock that is lost to short-term rentals, and this is before this vision, this new vision of Airbnb, is astronomical, in the thousands in most cities. I mean, it's crazy. And if you look at some maps, it's amazing. Like, if you look at a map of London, if you look at a map of Athens, if you look at New Orleans, the other day I was looking at the red dots, where they plot all the, and it is absolutely criminal. And in most places, these are not regulated, and not certainly not the original intention of Airbnb, which was you make a little extra income by renting out a room in your home. I mean, that's where it came from, right? So I'm quite worried about this vision also, because I've been, in the course of doing these directives, I have been in conversation with a whole bunch of journalists, researchers, and advocates in Mexico. Yeah. And you can imagine that Mexico is a very desirable place to land to work for a month, right? If you can work online, and you live in North America, and you live in Chicago where it's super cold, or, up in Canada where it's super cold, you can imagine how attractive it would be to go to Mexico. And the people that I was in discussion with, Push, the film, was touring throughout Mexico, and it was a huge hit because people are really fearful. I mean, they're seeing these, big towers going up that are intended for these short-term stays, and for people to just go there, work for a month, get away from the winter, et cetera. It's just, it's really catastrophic. I mean, the directives take this, head on, and basically completely restrict, say that short-term rentals should be completely restricted to principal residences only. So yes, I can use my home as an Airbnb to a maximum number of days per year, but I can't own a second property and use that second property as an Airbnb or a third property, or et cetera, or whole buildings that are just Airbnb. So we just decided as a group that the effects are too negative in terms of affordable housing stock, and it has to be controlled. We suggested that in over touristed areas, that short-term rentals should be strictly limited. That sort of thing, trying to curb, because it does come with touristification as well. So this is happening in some jurisdictions already. So we're riding on the coattails of existing jurisdictions where they've seen this as a problem. Amsterdam, for example, tried to restrict, completely ban Airbnb from over touristed areas, but got pushed back in the courts. Airbnb is one of the most litigious companies. So that's the problem when municipalities try to move forward and do something progressive to restrict Airbnb. They find themselves in courts of law.
No, it's the power of these companies, and I think people really need to understand that their vision for what there are housing systems, like, it is really dystopian. Airbnb, the other platforms, the investor funds, the people who make big money, and of course at the heart of it is an issue around the whole pension question. So many of our pensions and pension funds investment is tied up in this real estate investment. And I think it's just so, it's so warped. Like, we have German pension funds coming in, buying up, blocks of apartments. And these are public sector pension funds. We know that we're likely to have our own, I know we do have our own pension funds in this country, investing in the only Irish residential REIT, IRES REIT. So you've got like this bizarre situation, and the government just introduced this new measure where they're proposing to auto-enroll everybody in a pension, because they accept that when people retire, because of the increased renting, that people will need some sort of income to cover their rent. So you could have this bizarre situation whereby your pension is going to a REIT and investing in them, which then is locking you out of housing, but you need to have an income reduction and pay a pension so that you can pay your pension to the REIT when you retire in your rent. Like, it's just really, and I think this is part of the thing. We need to challenge the idea. I think we need, I don't know whether this is in the directives or not, the ethical divestment campaign, like you had around fossil fuels. It was actually Niall Carson who was I was chatting to, who suggested this to me as an idea. We were chatting over and back that, we should have the ethical divestment of pension funds out of REITs.
Yeah, we do cover that. Not put quite like that, though. Now, this is going to be the directives will be a living document, so I can doctor this and put that more direct language. But we definitely talk about not so much. We didn't want to just talk about ethical investing or divestment. What we wanted to talk about was human rights compliant investing. And so that's what we suggest. But I think there's huge scope with pension funds to expose to expose the hypocrisy that you just exposed, right? And that's what happens at the end of Push the Film. I don't know if you'll remember, because you probably saw it ages ago, but we talked to some tenants in Toronto, one of whom was on a pension, and their pension fund was investing in the housing that they could no longer afford. I mean, it's ludicrous. It's a zero-sum game, right? And
except
that's what we have to expect.
Except for the wealth funds and the wealth fund managers, and those who do own multiple properties, and that's part of it. And I think that's the big challenge, I think, that's needed, and why the human rights frame is so important, is that we do need to challenge the idea that people can just make unlimited money from property and real estate.
Exactly.
They shouldn't be allowed.
That's right.
That we have to restrict it, that people need to understand people need a home. That should be the primary function of real estate and housing systems. Yeah,
exactly. And I mean, that's the thing. I always say to, when I have the fortune of talking with folks who are inside the industry, whether they're investors or whether they're housing developers, that they have to understand that it's not a business like any other business.
Yeah.
It is an area that is a human right. And
Yeah.
therefore you need to exercise different business practices, period.
Yeah.
And, that's we're trying, you and me, Rory, we're trying to undo a very entrenched system and way of thinking that it's not easy to undo. But I mean, that's part of the role of these directives, right? Was just to open the door to a different conversation.
Yeah.
But one of the things that amazes me is the lack of accountability, period. Like any of the actors involved, whether it's states or whether it's investors, whichever investors, pension funds, et cetera, there's no accountability mechanisms for this, or very few. And I really tried to push that I think it's Directive 9 in the shift directives, was like enhancing and beefing up accountability mechanisms and independent accountability mechanisms. We talked about ESG. Well, what good is this ESG criteria if it's a self-governing, self-monitoring? The industry is going to suddenly regulate itself in a way that is human rights compliant, right?
Yeah.
It's not going to happen.
No,
so we really need some kind of independent mechanisms. National human rights institutions are well placed, or could be well placed, if they abide by the Paris principles. If they're truly independent, they could be well placed to form or perform some kind of monitoring and accountability in this area, especially where you don't have the right to housing, let's say, in legislation or a constitution, which would serve as an accountability mechanism. So I'm trying to push that as well, because that at the end of the game, we have to hold these investors' feet to the fire, and we have to hold states' feet to the fire.
Yeah. And ultimately, isn't it, though, come back to that, when you look at the countries that have the most successful housing systems, and obviously, they're all under pressure and, have been part financialized, or, to different extents, but the ones a lot more successful than Ireland or Canada anyway, the likes of, Austria, Vienna, Denmark and Copenhagen, Amsterdam, social housing, the provision, the building, the direct building of social and affordable housing by local governments, by not-for-profit bodies, like, it is so much more. It is, they provide such a higher proportion of all housing. It's available to people on lots of incomes. It's beautifully designed, that ultimately that's the solution to this, like, is alongside these, regulations we need, and human rights, and why, all these we need, because ultimately the funds can only provide housing when there's a market for them. And governments walked off the pitch 20 years ago and basically handed housing over to them. That we need to get government, local councils back on and building affordable and social housing for people.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a huge part of the solution. I don't think it's the only solution.
No, it's not the only.
But certainly, I mean, what worries me, Rory, and why I probably don't put too many of my eggs in that basket, is that countries like yours and mine, we are so behind on the build of social housing and so out of it, that what needs the ramping up is huge, that needs to happen, right? I mean, in Canada, the government divested from social housing, stopped engaging in social housing in the mid-90s.
Yeah.
So we've got a huge time lag that needs to be made up. And so I do push government on that front, but also to say, okay, and insofar as we've got this market that's not working for people who are low income and poor, we got to figure out how to make it work.
And middle income now as well is the
that's
point.
Exactly. Middle income. Absolutely. No, that's absolutely right. And the thing is, what I try to suggest is that some of this market housing needs to become social housing.
Yeah.
Now, because we're never going to building is expensive, especially right now with inflation, et cetera. We're never going to be able to build enough, but couldn't we harness existing units that are Airbnb units, that are financialized units? Couldn't we harness existing units and convert them into social housing? And as well as I do, that that's what the Berliners were on about with the referendum.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I mean, I think there's a lot to be said for that kind of they call it, I think, socialization of housing. And
Yeah.
I think there's something to be said for that. And that's not purchasing existing units at market rent. I mean, market value. That's forcing these big actors to cough up some of their yield and make it social housing. And that would require a very strong state and legislation, right? So I do think there's something that needs to be explored there for sure. That's in the directives as well.
Great. And no, it's so important to have that, because for me, I think, even you say it's such a long time, that I think unless we start soon, the longer we leave it, the worse it's going to get.
Totally.
And
it has to be huge, right?
Yeah, it has to be
these little marginal programs. I mean, I see government celebrating 50 affordable units over here and 75 over there. I'm like, yeah. And how many people do you have living in homelessness?
Yeah.
Like thousands and thousands. Little piddly project over here and there is not going to cut it.
No.
I mean, you look at what Singapore has been doing for 50 years now, right? They build en masse housing that is intended for their population. It's scaled based on income. I mean, right?
It can be done. It can be done, and it's and I think that's the point, that this isn't some unsolvable, situation, that this is something that countries are doing. As I said, there are countries that do this very well. It's not something we have to try and come up with some magic solution to. It is very clear, and it is about our housing systems, being shaped around and driven by the principles and values of a human right to housing, affordable, secure, tenure, decent standard, that is set out, that you articulated so incredibly in your tenure. So listen, in terms of what's happening now with the directives, you're presenting it to the EU.
That's right. Going to the European Parliament later this afternoon. Yeah, I'm leaving Canada this afternoon, heading over to Brussels. There will be a screening of Push the Film for parliamentarians who may not know about the phenomenon of financialization or how it works. And then along with a colleague and friend, Professor Manuel Albers, whom you may know.
Yes, we've had on the podcast before.
There we go. So he and I will introduce the directives.
Yeah.
And then there will be a panel discussion with a few European experts, including the member of European Parliament who is hosting me, Kim Van. And I always forget her last name.
We'll find it.
Yes, I will actually, let me get it, and I will just say that again, and maybe you can edit this.
Yeah, we can, of course. Yeah.
Yes. We'll be joined by Kim Van Sparentak. That's her name, Kim Van Sparentak, who's a Green member of European Parliament from the Netherlands. And she's hosting a panel discussion. She has been a huge advocate of the human right to housing and has commissioned a European report to talk about and discuss what's happening at European level. So should be a great event. It'll be followed by cocktails. That's always good.
Great. And you'll be absolutely exhausted from your flight.
Yes.
But listen, well done. It's brilliant to see it, and people can check it out. It's theshift.org. Is that right?
That's right. And /directives.
Yeah.
It won't go live until June 2nd, but presumably this is being aired after June 2nd. So
yep. People can check that out at the directives, and hopefully we'll have you back to Ireland, and it would be great to launch them here.
I would love to do that, Rory. And your work has been so important on the issue of financialization. I've learned a ton through you and your writing. You are a prolific writer. I wish I could be so I don't know how you do it. You're amazing. In any event, it would be really cool to do something together for sure, in person, face to face.
Yes, absolutely. And I know there's a lot of people in Ireland would love to hear you, and particularly as we try to progress the right to housing, the constitutional referendum, but also those practical measures. Because we're actually at a very interesting point as well here. Dublin City Council, I don't know if you're familiar, I've been following this. They have, in their development plan, put in a measure whereby build-to-rent developments would have to have 40% of housing for sale to home buyers. So we're actually putting a restriction. but our National Planning Authority has said that that is in breach of national guidelines. So there's a bit of a face-off at the moment. But I think it was very significant that it's in the development plan, and I think that that is likely. We're likely to see more of that. And yeah, I think that our housing crisis here, unfortunately, is just continuing to worsen. We're seeing emigration again, young people emigrating, not so young people emigrating. But at the same time, I think what's interesting about the directives for me and what's happening is that there's a value shift happening as well. That, you know, people who have been excluded, so many people excluded by the crisis, younger people are understanding and changing. They don't see housing as property. They see it as home, you know, and they see that that's what housing, that's the purpose housing should serve. And I think that that's the real, the value shift we need to harness. So I'm really looking forward to, meeting you again, coming over, launching this, getting it going. And I'm looking forward to seeing the reaction to the launch. And hopefully it will, it'll continue on. Anyway, it keeps the pressure on.
Exactly. Well, I do, as much as I feel like retiring now that I've written this, I do recognize it is a beginning of something, certainly for the shift. And I'd be really happy to join you in Ireland, and let's just keep moving this stuff forward.
Great.
We're going to win. We're going to win.
We are, absolutely. It's only a matter of time. It's not if, but when.
That's right.
And listen, thank you so much for all the amazing work you do. We really appreciate it.
No, thank you. And thanks for this discussion. It was really great.
Great. Well, listen, Leilani, thank you so much for coming on Reboot Republic.
Pleasure, as always.
And that was Leilani Farah, who is the director of the Shift Housing Movement, former UN rapporteur. You can check out the directives on theshift.org. And listen, thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Share this around. Really appreciate it if you share it around on social media. Let people know you're listening. And put up comments on social media, Instagram, Twitter. Share the link to the pod. It's great. It lets people know that this is out there. And really, there was so much there in what Leilani said that, you know, we need to understand, we need to listen to, we need other people to hear. This is about a conversation as well. And this isn't just about banging people over the head. This is about with what way we think it should be. This is about deepening understanding of housing as a human right and that's fundamental role, and all of us understanding that, everybody involved. So listen, please do share it around. And as always, if you can become a patron, please go over to patreon.com/TortoiseShack. Sign up whatever you can. Keep this podcast on the road. Thank you so much, and we'll talk to you all soon.